Hello, everyone. My name is Monique Thompson, and I am a member of FAB, F5 Appreciates Blackness, EIG, and part of the leadership team. And today we are super excited that we are doing our inaugural fireside chat for Black History Month with our own president and CEO, François Locoh-Donou. I'm excited today because we're going to talk to him about what Black History Month means to him, understand more about his own personal journey to success, and find out what he sees and his views about what he wants to do for diversity and inclusion at F5. François, thank you so much for being here today. First, I want to say personally, thank you. It's an honor to be here, to be at a place with F5, where we have a Black CEO and president of a technology company, which, as you know, is very rare. So I'm excited to speak with you today, and I just really appreciate you being here. And I wanted to also say that we are here today with a live audience, and we'll have a live Q&A at the end of this session as well. And so this is a first for us, François. We've done videos before, but we have a live audience here because we wanted to get this active participation. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Monique. Today is a special day as well for me, and I thank you and I thank FAB for organizing this event. I have been in the technology industry almost 25 years, and in the 25 years in the technology industry, this is the first time that I'm going to get a chance to talk about this. So it is also a special day for me, and I'm just really happy to be here.
Well, thank you. Well, you know what? Let's just jump into it. We have a little bit of time here today. I'll start with an easy question for you first. And just, can you tell me a little bit about, as you just said, this is the first time in 25 years that this has happened for you. What does this Black History Month mean to you?
It means a lot. And so let me start. As you know, Monique, I didn't grow up in America. I grew up in Africa. And from the moment I came here, it was always clear to me that anything I could do in America, any chance I had at being considered for a job or a corporate career, that was the result of a lot of people that had gone through a lot of struggles in this country, from slavery through legalized discrimination, through the civil rights movement, and a lot of unsung heroes that had fought through certain struggles that allowed people like me to come into this country and have a chance at having a career. So the first thing it means for me is there's just realizing, reminding myself, knowing, acknowledging that the work that we do, the chance we have at having careers today, that we're standing on the shoulders of a lot of people that have come before us and have done great things. And that's, when I think about Black History Month, I think about that first and foremost. I also, of course, I think about celebrating, the people we know that have achieved great things for African Americans in this country, including the most famous of them, the Martin Luther Kings and others. But also, I think about a number of thousands of people that we don't know that have gone through a lot in this country. And sometimes we discover them as stories get told nowadays. Black History Month for me it's also a time to celebrate and empower African Americans to achieve more, and a time for people who are in other groups to learn about the adversities that we go through, whether it's in the streets or in the corporate world when we have a chance at careers. But I think there's an element of learning about what we go through that I think doesn't happen enough today in the corporate world because race is such a difficult issue. And so I think, it's the start of a dialogue for me. That's what Black History Month is also for me.
Thank you very much. Speaking of you growing up in Africa, you've had quite the journey from Togo, Africa to CEO. You lived in Africa until you were 15, and then you moved to France. And now you're here, the CEO of F5 Networks technology company. Can you tell us and share with us a little bit about your own personal journey of success? How did you get here today? What are some of the levers that you pulled in order to achieve your success?
We could talk about Togo for a long time, but I want to talk about the things that are relevant that perhaps would also help others think about their recipe for success. And so for me, there are a couple of principles. I wouldn't say that I knew them or understood them if I go back 20 years ago, but now with hindsight, I think there are things that I did consistently that have helped, and I believe would help others as well. So the first one is, I have always been curious, but I have applied it as a dogmatic discipline to everything I do. And so for me, every conversation is a learning conversation. There is not a minute that I lose to learn everything and anything about any subject. Just before coming here, I was in the makeup room with your son, and I learned a lot about his craft, in 5 minutes. And by the way, he knows a lot about it, and he's ready for great things. But I apply that to everything. And so, through my career, as I've gotten into new jobs and taking risks to get into new jobs, I have applied myself to learning very quickly, and it's allowed me to get sort of accelerated learnings and therefore accelerated performance in certain environments. So that's a big one for me, being curious and being always learning. I also add to that I am always prepared. And that's one of the things I've observed over time. In organizations, there is an unspoken truth about the reality of the corporate world, is that your results and your metrics and your goals and all of that matters. But what matters even more is the perceptions that people have about you. And the perceptions that people have about you, there are times in your career where they're what I call moments of truth. There are moments where you come into a big presentation or a meeting, or you're going to come into contact with people who can have influence in your careers, and you can influence their perceptions one way or the other. And there is no replacement for being prepared for these moments. There are too many times where I have seen people come into their moments of truth and bungle an opportunity to change the perception about themselves because they were not prepared. And so over time, by the way, I was unprepared a couple of times early in my career, and I kind of made a decision at some point that I would not ever be unprepared. And so that, I think, over time has served me. The third area I would go to is risk-taking. I have never taken a job in the last 20 years when I look back that I wasn't scared of. I have never taken a job that I couldn't actually, for periods of time, sleep at night because I thought, François, what are you doing? You're putting yourself in this job, you're going to fail, you're not prepared for it, you can't do it. But when you're in that situation, it's very uncomfortable, but you're also in a period of accelerated learnings. So when you combine that risk-taking with the desire to learn, things do accelerate. And so I think one advice I would have for folks looking at their careers and wanting to accelerate it is be prepared to take some risks and put yourself into uncomfortable situations. Because the longer you stay in situations where you're very comfortable, the longer you have diminishing returns on the time that you're investing in your career. And then the last thing I'd say is you've got to not only be willing to take risks, but you also have to be willing to force the timing on your career on certain changes. There's always a time where people tell you you're too young, or you're too this, or you're too inexperienced, or you're too that to go and do the next thing. And why don't you wait an extra 2 or 3 years? And over time, I've learned that the extra 2 or 3 years is not going to do anything for me. And so exactly. I have been willing to say, well, I know you're saying no, but you're going to have to make a move, or I'm going to make a move. So sometimes you have to be willing to force timing on your career. So those are things that I think over time, when I reflect, that I've done that have helped me accelerate. But there is one other thing that I think is important, and I want to mention it, and it's sponsorship. I was very, very lucky in that early on in my career, as it was in the early days of me starting in the technology industry, that I started working with somebody who eventually became the CEO of our company, Sienna, and who became my sponsor. I will tell you, I never understood at the time the importance of sponsorship, and this happened by accident, and this person took me under their wing and saying that they were going to not just mentor me, but sponsor me, which means they were willing to put their own political capital on the line to help me grow in my career and say, no, he's going to get this job because he needs to get to the next thing. And this had a very, very significant effect on my career. And I insist on sponsorship, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later, because I think that's one of the challenges for us African Americans is in a majority white corporate world, we don't have the same access to sponsorship. And so there's things that we have to talk about and do to try and find ways that we can get more sponsorship for African Americans in corporations. This is something that doesn't happen. I think it's one of the reasons that we get frustrated in our careers in corporate America.
Wow, Francois, those are some powerful insights and very true. When you have been faced with challenges, what kinds of things have you had to overcome internally within your own self and externally? Mm-hmm. What kind of things did you have to address and overcome, and how did you overcome those things in the course of your career?
Well, so, before I talk about the things that I had overcome, I want to give you some context for me, because I said I was naive earlier. I want to explain what I mean by that. When I grew up in Togo, what we knew of America was essentially the things that America exports. So music, entertainment, sports. And so I grew up having this view that to be black in Africa was to be poor, but to be black in America was to be rich and famous. Because, for me, the black America was Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, Naughty by Nature. It was, all the things we were, dancing to, and the movies and the sports. And so we were looking at, hey, if you're black in America, you're running the show. And so when I came to this country, at 25, when I started working here, I came in and I had this view that this was kind of what things were. Now, I learned very quickly
that was not true.
what it was to be black in America. And so when you ask me what I had to overcome, I will share a few experiences that I'm sure, a lot of members of the FAB, if I share these, will resonate. And I'd be surprised if any member of the FAB, the things I'm going to go through, would not have experienced them. So very, very shortly after I arrived in the States, I had bought my first car, and I was really happy. I was going to play a soccer game. A cop pulled me off, supposedly for speeding violation. Mm-hmm. I didn't know anything about America and cops. And so when they stopped me, I got out of the car to go speak to the gentleman.
Now, should we pause for a moment and explain to people why I just kind of had that response? Being a black man in America, you don't get out of the car. You don't move. You make sure that your hands are visible on the steering wheel, because unfortunately, a lot of police officers see black men as an immediate threat, like a life-threatening kind of threat. And so with that, you don't get out of the car. Okay, and so I continue. I just wanted to explain why there was a gasp from certain members in the audience so that people that are listening understand why.
I learned all of that in the space of 3 minutes. Because within 3 minutes, this cop had his loaded gun, pointed at me, shouting at me to get back in the car. Eventually pulled me out of the car, searched me, handcuffed me. There were 3 police cars around me because he had called for reinforcement, searched me for drugs, searched the car for drugs, and this whole thing was going on. And I had no context to understand it. I share this with you about the naivete. I thought this guy is just crazy. I just came out of the car to talk to him, and he's behaving this way. I will tell you, it took a lot of years for me to understand how much danger I was in. And it wasn't until Black Lives Matter and all of the things that came out with social media, where I was seeing, every other week, a black person being shot by a cop, that I understood really what went on for me 20 years ago. Yeah. And I didn't understand it. And this is part of some of the things that I think happen to African Americans outside of work. It's a part of our lives that we cannot bring into the corporate world. No. And that's one of the frustrations for me of a corporate career. Is there's a part of our identity that we can't bring into the corporate world, because it's not a discussion you can have with a white colleague that they would understand or really relate to.
Yes.
So, and I would say that perhaps that interaction was actually for me the start of my journey of understanding what it is to be Black in America.
Wow.
And then a number of the things that happen in the corporate world, I want to say that I'm sure everybody else has experienced. I remember the first meeting I was at was I was getting ready to make this big presentation where I was prepared for one of these big presentations, but I walked into this ballroom, it was a QBR, and one of the senior vice presidents that was there, who hadn't met me yet, she asked me to go organize a round of coffee for everybody. She thought I was a hotel clerk. A few months later, I was in a hotel waiting for colleagues, and we were going to a meeting together, and not one but two guests at the hotels came and gave me their keys because they assumed I was the valet. Or the number of times you go to meetings and you are. It is assumed that you are the most junior person in the room, or you are dismissed. And I say, even today as CEO, I've gone to meetings with white colleagues where perhaps people haven't done their research, they don't know who's who in the room, and they start the meeting and they weren't prepared. And they'll start the meetings and for 5 minutes, they'll speak to my colleagues.
Yes.
Because they assume that this is where the most senior person is in the room. So these types of microaggressions, I think every African American that has a career in the corporate world experiences them in some form or fashion. Yes. Taken in isolation, they're one thing. Taken over time, they can degrade a person's sense of worth. Yes. And that, we all deal with it. Mm-hmm. If I reflect, I wish I had more courage to educate people as I went along. It's easy for me to do it now. Like I will see interactions, right? And I will say, well, let me explain this. Because a lot of times when these microaggressions happen, I think they happen out of place of not knowing or a bit of ignorance for folks, not of a place of malice. And I think as you start educating and you start a dialogue, people their eyes get open and they change their stance and they want to do better. And so, dialogue and education, I think, can change a lot of things. But it takes courage on both sides to get into that dialogue. And if I just go back on the 20 years, you asked me how I overcame it. I overcame it just largely by ignoring it and by sticking with it and just saying, hey, I'm never going to give up and I'm going to rely on my own strength to do this. But I wish I had engaged people more in dialogue. Because when I say we've got to create a more inclusive and diverse F5, part of it is education. And I would want to encourage everybody to play a role in that education. Wow.
That's some powerful stuff, Francois. I mean, just thank you for speaking from the heart in answering these questions. I know that the audience and people listening really appreciate it because it's real. It's something, as Black people, we face every day, in and out. No one has the ideas of what we go through, the grocery store where the clerk is speaking and saying hi to everybody until you get in the line and then your groceries are thrown and there's no greeting, there's no anything like that, those microaggressions that you talk about. Just this last December, Forbes magazine published an article called "The Dearth of the Black CEO," how corporate diversity and inclusion groups actually ignore people of color. Part of the article talked about the fact that if we were to extrapolate, about 10% of the Black population actually has college degrees. And of the Fortune 500 companies, one would then assume that at least 10% of those Fortune 500 companies would have Black CEOs. But that's not the case. There are actually only 4 Black CEOs of Fortune 500 companies right now, which is down from 7 less than a decade ago. And it talks about the fact that we're not seeing things move in the right direction. However, as you know, there are sometimes people that say and claim that, either they don't believe that there is prejudice and unconscious bias or conscious bias against Black people, Or some people feel like, we've arrived. It's no longer there. We had a Black president. Everything's okay, right? A Black president of the United States. F5 has a Black president and CEO. So everything must be okay. What would you say to comments like that? What do you think about those kind of perspectives?
I think, look, all the facts that you have stated are correct, but also unknown for a lot of people. And I think the comments around "we have arrived" come from a place of just not knowing. I think when I speak to my African American friends and colleagues around their careers in corporate America, if I had to summarize in one word what I hear, it's frustration.
Yes.
And frustration born out out of several things. Number one is experiencing things outside of work that are part of our identity that we cannot bring into work.
Yes.
And that we don't feel that others have the same challenge, or certainly that the majority groups have the same challenge. That's a source of frustration over time. The second frustration is the fact that the majority groups are often ignorant of the adversity that Black people face in corporate America. And that's an example. And one of those elements of ignorance is that when you're in the majority group, you think that the meritocracy that is at play for you, is the same meritocracy for everybody. And you don't see that it isn't. It's one of those things about privilege that when you are kind of recipient or beneficiary of a privilege, oftentimes it's difficult for you to see it. And I will say it as a man, I experience male privilege, but unless I get educated by women around what my privileges are, I don't actually know that adversity as well as I should. And so I think that's one of the sources of frustration for African Americans, is that the white majority group is not aware of the adversity that we face, and that meritocracy is not at play for us in the same way, because we don't have the same access to sponsorship, because we experience these microaggressions on a daily basis.
Yes.
Because most of the meetings we're in, you're the only Black person in the room, and the things that you have to go through in your head before a meeting starts, because you're the only Black person or you're the only Black female in the room,
yes,
nobody else has to go through that. And yet your performance is judged through the lens of a majority group. So when I look at all these things that I have these conversations, the overwhelming sentiment I hear is one of frustrations, which is why, if you look at the stats, more African Americans are saying they're going to leave their company in the next 2 or 3 years than majority groups. That's a manifestation of the frustration. So no, I don't think we have arrived. And by the way, I speak about that freely because ignorance is not something that cannot be fixed. I said it's about dialogue. Mm-hmm. And I don't speak about it with animosity because I consider myself to have been an ignorant person. I came in this country, as I said, at the age of 25 when I came here, I had no idea what it was like to be Black in America. I discovered it, and I'm still learning it today. Mm. I'm still learning it as a parent, raising children in this country. I have a son. The conversations I'm having to have with him, I never had these conversations growing up.
Right.
So as a parent, there's a whole new dimension of learning what it is. And I continue to learn from multi-generation African Americans about what it's like in America. Yes. Every other month, Jamila has to sometimes educate me about what I'm saying and give me a little nuance that I still didn't understand. So I'm still on a learning, don't you, Jamila? So I'm still on a learning journey, and that's why I speak openly about the necessity for dialogue and the fact that part of the reason we haven't arrived is because there is ignorance about our adversity, and that's not something that we Blacks have to bear the whole responsibility for changing that, I think, and creating a more diverse and inclusive F5, but also in other corporations, is we've got to get people who are white in the majority interested in learning about it.
Yes. So when you talk about educating people, about different things. You've talked about different times when they thought you were the valet and when people assumed that you weren't the CEO. Are there other instances that you've experienced where you've experienced resistance or differentiated treatment in corporate America because you're a Black man? And if so, how did you address it? I know that you said sometimes you let it go, but I can imagine with you, François, there probably were times where you may have had a conversation. And then the part two of this question is, what do you say to someone, a Black person at F5, if they feel like they have gone through that, if they've experienced differentiated treatment or resistance, or they feel like they have because they're Black?
Okay. Yes, I have experienced it. There were times where it was overt. And in those situations, I have had to confront people and say, look, I actually, and I've done it because I actually believe that the best way to enhance relationships is to raise the issues that threaten the relationship. Yes. And so, when I've had a colleague, or even somebody who wasn't a colleague but an acquaintance, do something that was overt, I confronted the person and said, look, you just did this and that. Let me tell you why this is actually extremely offensive. And I'm going to talk you through it. You and I may disagree and it may cause a separation in some ways, but you're going to know how I feel about it, because my own sense of worth requires that I tell you and you understand. And so I do actually encourage people to confront when it is overt. When it wasn't overt and it was these micro things that we all deal with on a daily basis, a lot of times I let it go because I felt, look, there's only so many battles you can pick, and sometimes you've got to be selective. Yes. And so over time, that's how I've dealt with it. My advice. And again, I'm looking here in hindsight, but my advice for people inside of F5, I think, is twofold. One is to find a way to educate in dialogue, because I do believe dialogue changes things. It's my firm belief that everybody at F5 means well, but sometimes doesn't know the adversities that we face, and that with education, we will go a lot further. And so my first piece of advice is to take an opportunity to educate others. And then if we feel we're not heard, there are now many resources in F5 that can help someone who is not being heard be heard, whether it's Fab or Anna and the leadership of the HR team and the things we're doing in D&I, or me. I'm always available. I've shared as it relates to these matters. There isn't somebody in F5 that wants to speak to me that I will not speak to in person. It may take a couple of weeks to get it scheduled, but I will do it because you know my belief about this, that I think people who work for F5 are largely volunteers. People who work for F5 could walk out of here and go work for any other technology company, in the industry. It's a booming industry. There is not enough people in the industry. And so if people choose to work for F5, then I choose to give my time and listen.
Thank you. Now, everyone heard that, right? So as we continue the conversation forward, I talked a little bit about the Forbes article. And it really does talk about the fact that diversity and inclusion has moved the needle forward for everyone except for people of color, because of the unique challenges and resistance that we face. And that makes it more of a challenge, because when people look at D&I, they think, okay, we're moving the needle forward. But in some ways, it's actually had the opposite effect for Black people. What are your thoughts about how F5 can continue to improve the recruiting, the promoting, the retaining, the educating of Black people for F5? And then in addition to that, how can F5 continue to ensure that the underrepresented groups, and since we're talking about Black History Month, Black F5ers as well, right? Not just recruiting, but what do we do with, and once we recruit people, what do we do once they're here, right? And what do we do to ensure that they feel part of the organization included, and that we're looking for talent to be able to promote, to be able to invest in.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I am, Monique, I'm actually very proud and I'm happy for what we have done in diversity and inclusion over the last 2.5 years. I will acknowledge that most D&I initiatives, and I would say it's the case for ours, and this is across the industry, but I think it's true for F5 as well, haven't really so far benefited the African American community. There are a number of reasons for that. And so there are things I think we need to do and can do differently. I'll start with your part around the recruiting and things like that. So we can be more visible in historical Black colleges. We started this year. I think we could do a lot more going forward. We started having a presence at Afrotech. I think we can have a much stronger presence going forward and be more visible and amplify our voice in the Black communities. We also need to do more, and this is an ask I have of you, and I have of every member of FAB here. My experience of, when Black people want to decide where they're going to go work, they talk to Black people.
Yes, they do. Yes, we do.
So they go to you and to me and others and say, how is it over there?
Yes.
So
it is so true.
We have a, I think we have a responsibility, and I'm asking us to talk to our people, say, look, F5 is a great place, and we're going to make it even greater for African Americans who want to come here. So there's things we can do ourselves to recruit our people to come here. I started recruiting your son, by the way, when I was in the
well, thank you very much.
So I apologize for that in advance. But
I'm alone for 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
But there's another point around what we can do for folks who are Black who are at F5 today. So one of the things, and I will want the leadership of FAB to help me with this, but Anna and I have started to talk about a program, a leadership development program for African Americans inside of F5 that we would conceive and launch over the next few quarters that would involve specific development for African Americans. I mentioned sponsorship being an issue, ways in which we could bridge the gap in sponsorship and networking inside the organization with a number of other participants. And I think something like that as a program, not just as an event, but as a program, could start to have an impact and start moving beyond what we're already doing in D&I, could start moving us forward. And then, of course, I have great expectations from the newly formed FAB, has wonderful leadership, and including this, by the way. This is no small thing. I mean, I know you have put a lot of time and effort in organizing this, but it is a start of a dialogue. Don't underestimate your voice and just getting us to talk about this, the impact it could have on the things we are going to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mm-hmm. That's exciting to hear. I don't know if there are very many companies that have that specific targeted focus for Blacks in their organizations to be able to ensure that there is a leadership program because of the fact that we are so underrepresented and there are so many things and we don't have sponsorship, as you said.
Companies of our size don't have that. So
Yes.
there are a few companies that have started this recently. They're typically Fortune 100 companies. So they're very large companies. Oftentimes, I would say there are B2C companies that have started that have I would say perhaps more pressure, more social public pressure than B2B companies,
Yes.
Or certainly than Fortune 1000 companies. I'm not aware of companies of our size that do this, but this is an opportunity for us to be first.
It's exciting. That is really exciting. Okay, my last question, I think, depending on how you answer. Do you have some kind of insight, inspiration that you would like to share with FAB and the other EIGs to carry us through 2020? That was inspiring in and of itself, knowing that program is there. But is there anything else you'd like to share with us about your vision for diversity and inclusion, for FAB, other things like that you just want to leave with us to carry with us for the rest of the year?
I would want to, here's what I would say that the FAB members is, the adversity that you go through, that I understand it. I understand it. I've gone through it myself. And what I would want you to know is that this is a game of progress. I mean, in many ways, in this country, we have been at it for 300 years. And there is still a long way to go. It's not a game of perfection, it's a game of progress. And if F5 can be one beacon of progress, then I think we will all be proud of what we have accomplished. And so I know the frustration that exists in corporate America, and I'm sure it exists at F5 for African Americans as we go through our careers. And my ask would be stick with it, because we're going to make progress. Progress in our case comes from a place of energy, it comes from the heart, and that's what changes things.
Wow. Thank you for honoring us with your presence, your insight, and for being vulnerable and open with us today. We couldn't have asked for more.